And do I refer to you as Travis?
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
fine.
Okay. Okay,
No
awesome. I
problem.
just I didn't know what the W before the Travis was.
It's my first name. My parents decided that they would be weird, and my brothers and I all go by our middle names. So,
Dude, I do too. So my
how
actual
about
birth
that?
name is Alexis, and when we came from Puerto Rico to the United States,
Hmm.
at that time it was kind of more of like a girl name than a guy name, so they
Yep.
went with Enrique, which is my middle name, but then Kike
Okay.
is like a nickname for Enrique. So I guess I go
Gotcha.
by my middle name, but then like
A
a
nickname of
nickname
it.
version of that. So it gets really confused. It made it really annoying, like when in elementary school they would call out the roll
Oh
call,
yeah.
and you
Yeah.
had to explain it.
Yep. Yeah, I had a job working groundskeeping at a golf course all through high school,
Nice.
and they just called me by my first name, and I just got tired of trying to get them to do anything else. And so whenever I went there, I was my first name. Everywhere else, I was my middle name. It certainly creates an interesting dynamic.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Well, Travis, it's really great to have you on Psyche Podcast. I'm looking forward to our conversation exploring Karl Barth and his theology and spirituality. But
Yeah,
before
thanks
we,
for having me.
of course, but before we kind of jump into the conversation, would you mind just spending a few moments kind of telling the listeners a little bit about yourself? Kind of what you do for a living. Any projects you're working on, just so that we get a sense of who you are, and then we can kind of jump into the conversation.
Sure. Um, so what I do for a living is I look at spreadsheets, basically.
Okay.
So I'm the associate dean for the College of Arts and Humanities at Lindenwood University, and I kind of focus on academic operations. So I'm the guy who makes sure the classes get scheduled, the instructors get assigned, the students get enrolled, all of that stuff. Plus, just trying to manage faculty. Herding cats is too calm a description for
Got
that
you.
task. But yeah, that's what I do as my day job. I do teach a little bit, so I'm a professor of religion at Lindenwood as well,
Okay.
and I'm gearing up to teach one of my favorite classes this fall. The title is simply Jesus, and so we have all
Mm,
kinds of fun with that. I spend so much time looking at spreadsheets. I don't have a lot on the go in terms of scholarship, but I'm kind of chipping away at a couple things, including I wrote a book a few years ago on Helmut Gollwitzer, who is one of Karl Barth's students. And I would love to do more translating of his work because there's still quite a bit of it that's not in English. So that's one thing I'm kind of chipping away on in the very little bit of spare time that I get. But that's balanced. I have my family, my wife, and two boys who are both Boy Scouts, and I'm a Boy Scout leader at this point and
oh, nice.
planning camping trips and going backpacking and trying to get out into the woods whenever possible. That's where I have been spending most of my free time lately. So
Oh, very
that's a little
cool.
bit about me.
Yeah, no, I love that. Man, I know this could be an entire, separate episode, but I saw that you were into the helmet guy. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about him. Like, do you have like a quick summary about who he was and his work? Because I'm kind of
Sure.
interested.
Yeah, he's an interesting guy. So he was one of Barth's students, but before that, he was actually involved in the Hitler Youth, and
Oh
if you can
wow.
believe that. The 1920s in Germany was a really interesting time, and so Gollwitzer came from a conservative family in Bavaria and kind of got swept up in his teenage years in some of that more radical fringe, um, authoritarian side of things. And they had lots of youth groups and folk groups emphasizing folk culture. He got really into folk music at that time. Um, and he was actually like kind of on the fringe. I don't know if you're familiar with the beer hall putsch in Munich.
No, I'm not.
And well, Hitler actually got arrested. It's a whole big story. But
Okay.
Gollwitzer was kind of on the fringe of that as that all went down. And then he went to university. His dad was a pastor, so he studied theology and kind of got caught up in dialectical theology, which was the movement that Barth, among others, were instrumental in getting going. And at one point, he's just like, okay, he burns all of his correspondence from his earlier years. He kind of wipes out everything he can get his hands on to kind of break those ties, and then shifts his focus and ends up part of the Confessing Church with Barth, which was an organization of Christians in Germany who were trying to resist the Nazi administration of the churches and what was called German Christianity. We might get into that later. So anyway, he makes that big shift, and then he ends up getting, well, I'm going to spend this whole time talking about Goldwitzer. He ends up getting drafted into the German army during World War II, and they didn't really have conscientious objectors. Like, you either went or they put you against the wall and shot you. So he wasn't quite ready to die.
Sure.
And at first he was assigned to a machine gun company, but he very quickly got himself reassigned into an ambulance corps. And he felt that he could at least do that in decent conscience as a Christian, and with his commitments. And he said after the war that he managed to make it through without ever having to fire a weapon. And so he was really happy. I don't want to say pleased with himself about that, but he was very pleased. He was very relieved that he never had to be in that situation and try to make that decision, because I don't, who among us knows exactly how we'll react and exactly how we'll feel about it.
Right.
So, but he ends up getting captured when the Eastern Front collapsed, and he spends 5 years in Russian POW camps, and then comes back to Germany, and gets back involved with teaching theology, and does that for a few decades. At first, he's a little bit more conservative when he comes back, because he's just spent time in Stalinist Russia, and he spends a lot of that time reading Marx. And while he's sympathetic to the ideas, he's seen it in practice and not from a particularly good angle. And so he's kind of pulling back from that a little bit through the 50s. And he also gets involved in the debates at that time about German rearmament, about nuclear armaments. But then as he gets into the 60s, he gets more involved again in Christian and Marxist dialogues. And then in 1967, he's teaching at the Free University of Berlin, which is a university that Americans set up in Berlin, funded with American money. It's this, big shiny thing, and he ends up teaching there. And the students there in 1967 basically have a little student revolt. They are protesting, they are rioting, all of these different things. And Goldwitzer actually was close with some of the leaders of the students in that movement and really got to understand them and what they were on about. And that helped him shift his perspective yet again. And he swung back, the pendulum of his thought swung back. And then from about then on through the end of his life, he was very much to be found consistently on the left, and protesting environmental causes, or for environmental causes, protesting various kinds of colonial issues. I've got pictures that I got from his family over in Germany of him getting carried out of protests by the
Wow.
police and all these things. So he was a really, really interesting guy.
Oh, he sounds fascinating. Okay, he's somebody I'm gonna have to kind of write down and kind of research a little bit more. Thank you for that kind of intro. That was great.
Yeah. Well, my book is called Our God Loves Justice, and the
Okay.
first chapter is biography.
Oh,
So,
nice. Okay.
yeah.
So Travis, I know, going back to kind of Bart for a second, one of the first things I wanted to kind of ask you was how did you first get into Bart as a thinker? Maybe you could kind of
Yeah.
trace that out a little bit, and then we can kind of go from there.
Well, I grew up in an evangelical context, non-denominational North American Christianity, and my family was kind of Reagan Republican. And
Okay.
so to this day, I kind of wake up every morning with that default setting in my brain. And I
Yeah.
always joke I have to be converted anew every day, and kind of,
Hey,
because I
that
still
stuff runs deep, right?
it does. I still have a lot of those instincts that I have to try to be cognizant of. But
Mm.
I was raised in that kind of environment. And I mean, it's interesting. It wasn't as crazy as it is today, but the points of continuity, the seeds are there. But anyway, I learned the Bible really well.
Mm.
And there are worse things that can happen to somebody in their youth. And thankfully, because I'm a white guy, I got through the experience without any of the more obvious traumas that other folks experience, and so I'm really obviously privileged and lucky in that way.
Mm.
It's much more subtle, the sort of shaping and reimagining that I've been working on myself with. But I learned the Bible really well, and even before I went to college, I got into John Calvin. And so I'm reading John Calvin, and I love Calvin to this day because his theology and is so biblically infused. Like it's really, really compelling in that regard. But to know what Calvin's doing, you got to know the Bible. And Calvin's trying to make sense of all that. And so I'm reading Calvin. I go to Wheaton College, and I don't know if you're familiar, but it's kind of the joke for people from Wheaton is that it's the Harvard of evangelical
That's
schools,
what
the
I've heard.
Harvard of
Yeah.
Christian schools, right? So it was a really fascinating place to be when I was there. It's got a very different feel right now.
Mm.
But when I was there, there was this core of really thoughtful faculty and students, and I'm still, good friends with some of them today. And the faculty there in the theology department, I did Bible and theology as my major. That's where I first encountered Barth. And I actually got to study, as I had as my advisor, Mark Husbands, who was one of John Webster's students. And John Webster passed away a number of years ago now, but was one of the leading English interpreters of Barth through the 90s and the 2010s.
Gotcha.
So I got a really good formation there and got introduced to Barth and taught to read Barth. And then Mark is the one who kind of pointed me at Princeton Seminary. And so I went to Princeton and just continued studying Barth from there. I've always been interested in what I think of as practical theology, which is not really the discipline of practical theology that's trying to solve its own problems. I don't have an issue with it whatsoever. But for me, it's where does the conceptual rubber meet the practical road? Like you've got people out trying to live the Christian life. You've got people out gathering together in these Christian communities. And at some point, everything that you're doing theologically, all of these complicated head games have to connect somewhere with that lived Christian thing. And so the doctrine of the church, the fancy words, ecclesiology, that's kind of always where I've worked. During my undergraduate, I did a thesis on the Lord's Supper, trying to think through the theology of that central Christian practice. And then as I got into grad school, I shifted my focus to baptism and then in Barth. And so my dissertation, published now, is on Barth's doctrine of baptism. So I went from this kind of focus on the Christian community and Christian practices and trying to think theologically about that to, okay, all of these different things that we do as Christians involve our body. We eat bread, we drink wine, we get dunked in water. And politics is really just about how we negotiate being in physical proximity to each other on a grand scale. So
Great way.
surely Christianity and theology in the gospel has something to say about how we organize our society. And so that's how I kind of made the turn into the more political side of Barth and into Gollwitzer. And interestingly enough, it happened. I was in grad school for the Great Recession.
Okay.
And so looking at writing on Barth at that time, looking at the prospect of needing to find a job, on the far side of that, one starts to pay attention to new things, right? And so I was fortunate that I've been very fortunate in the people that I've worked with throughout my education. But my doctorvater, who supervised my dissertation, is George Hunsinger, who works on Barth and politics. And so I was able to learn a lot from him, and work through a number of those things in conversation with him and really get some good formation from him in that regard. So that's kind of my journey to where I am now working on these sorts of
Dude,
topics.
that's so great, and I do hope that we can kind of get a little bit more into like Barth and politics and how you understand that. But I'm real curious if you can just take a step back. Can you speak to his doctrine of baptism? I'm just curious. Is there anything unique about it, or what was your angle on that? Yeah, if you can go there for a second.
Yeah, nope. I can go there for a few weeks.
Okay.
So Barth liked to be ornery and contrary,
Mm.
and he took a sort of pride in it, even though I think it also kind of hurt him in some ways. And his doctrine of baptism is one of those areas. So throughout the majority of his career, he kind of just assumed the basic Reformed theological position, which is you baptize babies because salvation is about the whole community, not just about individuals. God makes a covenant with a people, and just like baby boys were circumcised within the are circumcised within the Jewish community, so baby Christians are baptized within the Christian community. And that kind of connection to say that, yeah, circumcision is how Jewish folks bring people in, and baptism is how Christian folks bring people in. And obviously, you're going to do that for the babies of people in either community. That's kind of the basic Reformed position. And so Barth kind of kept that going, and kind of had his own spin on it through most of his career. But then later on, he rethought that in deep ways, and he writes it's actually the last piece of the church dogmatics that he publishes,
Okay.
is a set of lectures that he's reworked on baptism, and it gets referred to as the baptism fragment.
Mm,
But we have to be clear, it's a fragment in the sense that it would have been a part of a larger part volume of the dogmatics.
okay.
It is not itself fragmentary. Like, he worked it over, it's a fully integrated whole. Lots of people don't like it and what he says there, but it's Barth. Um, and he argues against infant baptism. He sets up a whole vision of baptism where baptism is kind of the first, maybe not in time, but in priority, the first Christian ethical response to the gospel.
Mm,
So somebody is awakened to the gospel through the power of the Holy Spirit, and the proper response to that is making this commitment through baptism to be part of this community, to bear witness to the gospel, etc. And so that's the structure that organizes his whole theology of baptism at that point. And if you think about infant baptism, it just doesn't fit. And he makes that point. He doesn't dwell on it for a huge portion of the text, but he very clearly makes the point that, yeah, if this doesn't apply to infants because they can't make that commitment, they can't choose that action. And
mm.
so he wants to find the meaning of baptism in that human action, as opposed to finding the meaning of baptism in some divine action.
Gotcha.
So that, as kind of the preeminent Reformed theologian of the 20th century, for him to just chuck the basic Reformed position and say, no, it's actually more like, well, North American evangelicals, come out of a Credo Baptist tradition, the Anabaptist or the Radical Reformation in Europe, kind of that heritage, to make that shift. I mean, that was just a big deal. And my issue was that people needed to understand what he was saying and why, on the one hand. But also, and again, my teacher, George Hunsinger, has said this, I've heard him say it a million times, like, the church dogmatics is a labyrinth
Mm,
with many different exits, right?
okay.
You get kind of down into the conceptual world of what Barth is up to, and you can build out pieces of the maze in lots of different ways. And I think it's perfectly consistent that Barth built his doctrine of baptism out this way. And I want people to understand why it's consistent. But I think there's other ways that you could build it out based on his own patterns of thought. And so that's what I try to do in my book. I try to explain, no, this is what he was up to and why it makes sense. But we could also do this other thing too, right? And so I try to ultimately, in the last chapter, offer what I think of as a Barthian doctrine of infant baptism. Like, how do we make sense of this
Mm.
using Barth's own conceptual tools? And I think there's lots of tools there that make perfect sense of how we can think through this. So that's kind of what I did with his doctrine of baptism.
Sure. Oh, that's great. Now, going back to your kind of notion of like practical theology, maybe even the political, are there any links there to baptism? Did you go there in your book or have you reflected on that? I mean, in terms of a Christian practice, do you see any, yeah, ways to think
No,
about baptism?
I didn't engage with my book on baptism. It does not have a political
Okay.
aspect. Um, that project got up and running before I had what I would consider my political awakening.
Okay.
Um, it happened, that awakening happened before I finished that book, but that project was kind of very much down the tracks and, needed to get done.
No, totally.
um, and I haven't reflected in a sustained way on the connection between baptism and politics. But like I said earlier, um, baptism is a very physical act for how the church designates the people who have been claimed by the gospel.
Yeah.
And that claim is a total claim. Like, you want to talk about totalitarianism, that's the proper totalitarianism, the total claim of God. Now, the kind of claim that God makes on us is one that frees us, not one that enslaves us. So it's not totalitarian in that sense, but it's a total claim. And that total claim involves every aspect of our lives, involves the political aspect, the interpersonal aspect, everything. And so that's the connection to the politics. Like, if you're going to say that Christianity is not just about something you believe, or is not just about something you feel, if it's something that also involves our bodies, and baptism says it does, then it's political.
Yeah. Okay, no, that makes total sense. Now, before we get into kind of your political awakening, because I'm super interested in that, can you go back and I'll just frame it this way. Maybe it's not exactly the right way to put it, but I've noticed that there's definitely different styles of Bart scholars. Or there's different perspectives on how to understand what he's doing. Some love him, some hate him. Can you kind of give us a sketch of where all that is in terms of like Bardians? That's probably getting into
Gosh.
the weeds a little bit, but are there like major schools or major kind of ways to interpret him?
For there used to be more so.
Okay.
Um, and scholars will still have fun with this. I mean, there's a couple different ways of talking about German reception of Barth in different categories. Um, you can do the same thing in English language reception. All of that's entertaining for people who are in the know, but I don't know how helpful it is for other folks. I think um, what I would want to say about Barth is that if you are a Reformed Christian, he is just such a supremely imaginative and creative exponent of that tradition that it's just a shame not to engage with. If you are, and then I would extend that also to Protestants as a whole. And because of that, Catholics and Orthodox as well, if you want to go somewhere to find a very comprehensive but also very creative articulation of Protestantism, go look at Barth.
Got
So
you.
he has that kind of stature. Now, um, he's still, because he encapsulates those things, he can also still very much contain all of the flaws and defects and failures of those traditions that he's working within so imaginatively and creatively. And so there is lots of room for criticizing him in terms of how whiteness has shaped theological traditions, in terms of how patriarchy has shaped theological traditions, in terms of how socioeconomic privilege has shaped. I mean, all of that's still very much fair game. And my feeling is Bard is exactly the place to do that work, because if you can articulate where Bart fails on these things, right, then that criticism is going to be much more broadly applicable to the traditions as a whole.
Okay.
So I really appreciate. I mean, there was a Bart conference back in June where some folks came and did some of this work in very decisive ways, and I wasn't able to be there. I've been kind of picking up the live streams and trying to digest it as much as I can along the way, and I really appreciate a number of the things that those folks did to illuminate ways that despite his creativity and imagination, Bart really still needs to have his blind spots and his biases and his assumptions laid bare and corrected. So all of that work still needs to be done, and at the same time, he's this imaginative, creative exponent of a flawed tradition. So, right now in English language theology, you've got the people who appreciate Barth, and people do it for many different reasons. You've got folks who, like me, come from a more evangelical background and have never imagined that theology could be done the way that Barth does it. And I'm a I'm a believer, so to speak. So I mean, there's just a lot of power in the way that he does it, and the way that he weaves together the biblical with the tradition, with the historical tradition, and his own creative insight. Which is why I think it made perfect sense for me to go from Calvin to Barth, because they're fundamentally similar theologians in that you have to know the biblical text to know what they're doing and really appreciate what they're doing. Um, so there's folks who are coming from that more conservative environment and see him as a way for them to enter a larger theological world. And
Gotcha.
so they appreciate him for that. There's other folks who are not coming from that context. Maybe they're coming from mainline Christianity, and Barth feels a little conservative to them, but he still, provides resources and needs to be criticized and so on. So you've got kind of this broad spectrum of people who appreciate Barth, and then you've got the people who don't appreciate him, whether because they're coming from communities that he does not represent, who have their own theological traditions. Um, and I always feel like throwing in the Seinfeld line, not that there's anything wrong with that. Um, or else they're very conservative
Mm.
and feel that Barth is just a betrayal of the gospel somehow. So yeah,
Gotcha.
that's kind of how I'd break it up, practically
Yeah,
speaking.
thank you, man. That's super helpful. Now, okay, going back to what you called your political awakening. I mean, I want to kind of hold that real quick, but then also maybe throw out one of the things that's drawn me to Bart and his thinking is just kind of his opposition to Nazism. And so I don't know if those two are connected for you, if kind of which one you want to tackle first, just as we
Yeah.
maybe kind of follow this thread of how he thought about like politics and Christian nationalism, and then kind of your journey of becoming politically awakened. I'm curious, yeah, if you could go there.
Okay. Yeah. So I was in grad school from, oh Lord, 2004 to 2011.
Okay.
And I was in my doctoral program from 2007 to 2011. And so the Great Recession was at the front end of that. And by the end of it, as I'm writing up the dissertation, um, we start getting the data on the recovery from the recession. And that's when all of the research on the rapidly increasing wealth inequality in the United States was first starting to be produced.
Sure.
And so we saw that, yeah, maybe we've come out of the recession according to some metrics, but there are very clear winners and losers in how this is playing out. And, I had just up until that point, and call it naivete, I'll call it naivete and privilege. I had just never thought about economics in that kind of a structural way. Full stop. I had never had to think beyond personal finance kind of levels.
Sure.
And so seeing all of that, looking at job markets for, scholars, um, it kind of brought that bigger picture home to me in a new and very concrete way. And when I began to become alive to that, Barth was there already with resources. Um, so let's take a step back now and talk about Barth. Um, Barth's own political awakening happened. I mean, he comes from a pastoral professorial family. His family was not what you would call super wealthy, but his family had everything that they needed, including, I believe, paid help, right? As was common for professors in Europe in the 19th century and early 20th century before the wars. Um, so he came from a comfortable family, and himself, when he's in school, he goes as once he gets his he passes his exams to become a pastor, and he's kind of being an intern at Calvin's church in Geneva, actually. And part of the work that he engaged with there was with the social question, as they called it. I did scare quotes for folks who are listening along, the social question. And that was really, how do we make society work for the poor along with everybody else? How do we address the need that we're seeing around us as the result of a century of industrial revolution and reorganization and so on? And he's engaged in some relief efforts, and he's talking to these folks in his community that are kind of on the not receiving end, so to speak. And so he's starting to pay attention to those things, and then he gets his first job as a pastor in his own right in the town of Saffenwil in Canton Aargau in Switzerland, and he goes and he becomes pastor there, and he'll spend about a decade there. And there were factories in that town, and he had both the factory workers and the factory owners in his church. And that made him think through all of these things even more. And it's really interesting. He actually exchanges public letters in the newspaper with the factory owner and his son on the one hand, and him on the other, advocating for the rights of the workers. And so he sees the situation, he sides with the workers, he works with them on unionization efforts. He puts on classes for them because, laborers at that time, they wouldn't have been college educated or anything like that. So he's putting on classes for them. Basically, here's how personal finance works. Here's how hygiene and basic medical care works. And he's just trying to teach them these practical skills, and at the same time helping them unionize, and at the same time getting involved in local socialist political meetings, even to the point that at one point they approach him to run for a local office as a socialist. So he's really shifting his perspective and seeing the way that capitalism, as it's articulated there, and I would argue it's fundamental to the system, exploits certain groups of people for the benefit of other groups of people. And he's resisting it. And increasingly, he's looking for resources to resist it. And he's finding some resources, but at the same time, he's also looking for additional resources. And that's kind of the situation he's in when World War I happens. And World War I blows his mind for two reasons. The first reason is that all of his teachers, the people with whom he studied theology, all of them support Germany in the war. Now, Barth's Swiss, but his education happens in part in Germany, and he's German-speaking Swiss, so there's a strong cultural connection there. That's kind of German theology is where his intellectual orientation is, and all of these folks come out supporting Germany in the war. And what's more, a number of them are part of a group that makes an argument that you need to support Germany in World War I because Germany needs more access to colonial territories for colonial expansion so that it can spread German culture, which includes Christianity. So it very directly links somehow the spread of the gospel with the German colonialist enterprise. And Barth couldn't believe it. Like, this shocked him. And he disagreed fundamentally. And I think it's because of his, up to that point, years of experience working in labor organization and seeing how colonialism is fundamentally exploitative. So that rocks his intellectual world. And now he's wondering, is this theological tradition that I've grown up in and studied and sunk my intellectual roots in, is it actually bankrupt? And he kind of answers yes on some key points. I mean, he continues to be decisively shaped by it. We never outgrow those kinds of influences, but he also develops these decisive criticisms of it. So that's one piece. He thinks that intellectually, theologically, the gospel has become captive to a cultural environment, to a particular national orientation. You want to talk about nationalism. He's really concerned about that intellectually and how it's working out in Christian support for the German war effort. At the same time, he's a member of socialist political parties. And in Germany for World War I, the German Socialist Party, it's the abbreviated SPD, um, they sign on for a suspension of debate and opposition for the duration of the war, which basically gives the government the powers to execute the war however they want without any kind of parliamentary um, pushback. And so Barth saw that as a fundamental betrayal, because I don't know if you're familiar at all with the socialist literature at the time. I mean, the socialist tradition portrays World War I as an imperialist war.
Mm.
It's all about imperialism and colonialism and, these conflicts in those spheres between the great powers. And that's how Barth saw it. And he saw probably the biggest socialist party political organization in Europe at the time roll over to nationalism and not resist this imperialist war. And so he talks about this as being a double betrayal. He's been betrayed theologically,
Yeah.
he's been betrayed politically, and he does not know what to do. And so he starts reading the Bible, if you can believe it. And he starts reading older theology, and he discovers that he calls it a strange new world, right? He's seeing it all with new eyes and seeing how different it is from the kind of world intellectually and sociopolitically that he lives in. And this is what fundamentally kicks off his work to reorient his thought into the tracks of what we now know as Barthian theology, dialectical theology, and so on. And his first attempts at that are Romans, two different editions of Romans commentary, and then he gets called as a professor at Göttingen to teach Reformed theology, and leaves that pastoral environment, and his thought begins to take on a very different cast. If you read his theology before that point and then read its theology afterwards, it's like in many ways two different parts. There's lots of continuities, but they also just feel very different. So that was his political awakening, so to speak, right? It's tied up with that, thinking in systematic ways, in systemic ways about wealth and poverty and economics, thinking then about how the stories we tell ourselves about our faith either help or hurt those systems and how they're functioning. And, all of it just through the incredible crucible of that First World War context is really what woke Barth up to the whole thing.
Got you. And then how does he end up responding later to, kind of in World War II, like Hitler and Nazism and the
Yeah.
confessing church? Can you go there a little bit?
Oh, sure. So so when Barth makes his quote unquote dogmatic turn, when he becomes a theology professor, basically, as opposed to a theological agitator, kind of as a pastor on the fringes of academic theology, he's now faced with the task of what does he tell students who are going to go out and find themselves in the position that he has found himself in? And how can he equip them um, to move through the process more quickly than he did, right? And to have resources that he didn't have when he started? That's really what he's trying to answer. And so he's delving into the tradition. He does a lecture cycle on Ulrich Zwingli. He does a lecture cycle on John Calvin. He's lecturing on different biblical books. He's lecturing on the Reformed confessions. He kind of turns the spotlight on his own formation, and he lectures on Schleiermacher, all of that in the first, 3 to 5 years of being a professor. And so he's trying to give them tools and trying to develop for himself an intellectual framework, a theological framework that, will proclaim the gospel, will, be faithful to scripture, all of these things that we normally try to do when we're doing theology. But also, and as an important part of that for Barth, how do we keep that double betrayal from ever happening again? Right? That's what's in his mind. Like, how do we set up a theological understanding that is not going to result in the equation of the gospel and Christianity with a particular nation's colonial enterprise? How are we going to stop that? And how are we going to set up a theological understanding that will shape people's ways of being in the world so that they get engaged politically, and when faced with a jingoistic nationalist upsurge in support of their nation's colonial undertaking, won't just roll over and say, yeah, fine, right? But will actually resist that kind of, in that kind of environment. So he's trying to build a theology that will kind of prevent socialists from betraying socialism and prevent Christians from betraying the gospel.
Yeah.
And he's trying to do that theologically. Now, is it possible to do that? I don't know. He made some important intellectual contributions, but he screwed some other things up. Um, he in his own life, he didn't necessarily live it out all that consistently all the time. Gollwitzer, who we were talking about before, talked about a bourgeois undertow in academic theology that it's hard to resist,
Mm.
and that, I mean, Gollwitzer was thinking about himself, but also about Barth, and the way that just being a professor of academic theology means that you care about a certain set of things more than other things, or at least they're more front and center. So all of that remains true, but he's trying to provide that kind of intellectual framework. And whether or not it's finally possible, or whether or not theologically can save us sociopolitically, which I have severe doubts about, um, you know, who can blame him for trying that particular task, right? And if his theology inspires folks who are rooted in Scripture, steeped in the theological tradition, to stop and say, wait a minute, let's think critically about how we see the socio-political and economic situation working around us, and let's realize ways that it's fundamentally unjust. Right? If Barth's theology helps a few folks do that, then we can't complain too much.
Yeah.
So
No, that
that's what he's up to through the 20s. He's trying to
okay.
build that edifice. Now, the 20s in Germany, and he's teaching in German universities. It's the period of the Weimar Republic, and Germany. It's one of those situations where it wasn't all that long ago that they had a monarchy, and then the kind of system that they had leading into World War One was kind of a constitutional monarchy, but it was still very centralized, very aristocratic, very conservative. And then you go from that and you throw them into a full-blown parliamentary democracy, like overnight, because they lost the war. They weren't ready for it. There were no traditions of it, and so it was a fundamentally unstable thing. Then throw in the Treaty of Versailles and all the reparations that Germany was forced to pay, whether or not you think it's fair that they had to pay them at the expense of the other great powers involved. Well, the winners make the rules. But there's rampant inflation. There's a horribly difficult financial situation just across German society. You've got a very tenuous political structure in place. And so there's lots of radicalism happening on the fringes on both sides. So there was almost a socialist revolution in Germany in the early 20s. I don't know how many people know this, if you're familiar.
No,
Um,
I'm not. Thank
Rosa
you.
Luxemburg, for instance, have you encountered that name?
No, I haven't.
So she was one of the leading thinkers involved in that, and she was actually extrajudiciously executed
Mm.
by the powers of the state. And it's actually the SPD again, the German Socialist Party, who helps crack down on this left revolution in this part of Germany. So that happens in the early 20s. And then by the late 20s, you've got the other side upsurging. And you've got the beer hall putsch with Hitler, as I mentioned before, in connection with Gollwitzer. That is effectively suppressed, but Hitler comes back a few years later, increasing electoral success. And then, through various twists and turns, becomes Chancellor of Germany, and I want to say 33 or 34. And then, most of us are broadly familiar with what happens then. But in the late 20s and early 30s, he's been building this, he's been working on this conceptual orientation that's meant to resist the equation or the identity of the gospel with a particular cultural culture or worldview or people or nation. He wants to resist that kind of identification. And then he sees the National Socialists, the Nazis. They're not actually socialists, but we don't need to get into all that. They're deeply, deeply capitalist when it comes down to it. But he sees them gaining in popularity, and he gets very worried because they are very explicitly making those kinds of identifications between the gospel and the folk, the
Hmm.
people. And it's a very nationalist articulation of things. And at that time in dialectical theology, it was a fairly diffuse movement. There were a number of leading thinkers. One of the other thinkers was Emil Brunner, and Barth and Brunner had a big argument and falling out over the question of natural theology. And this is actually one of the defining positions of quote unquote Barthianism, is the rejection of natural theology. From Barth's perspective, and you can complicate this in interesting ways, but from Barth's perspective, what you cannot do is look around you at nature, whether just looking out the window or through science, at society, at socio-political events, historical happenings. You can't just look around you and assume that you know what God is up to, or that you know what all of this means with reference to God and theology. And he thinks that when you make those kinds of assumptions, you're giving the game away. You're making that harmful identification between the gospel and something else. And that's what he sees happening when people say, oh, if you only understand nature the right way, it will be obvious that God exists. Or, oh, if you only look inside of you at your experience, the experience of your conscience when you sin, and how it convicts you, then you will know that that is God, right? The voice of God in your ear, or however they want to do it. And so Barth's saying no, and so his response to Brunner is 9 exclamation mark, the German word for no. He's saying no to all that because he thinks that's just one very short step away from where the Nazis are going to end up,
Mm.
where German Christianity is going to end up. And so he's like, you make this theological move and you open the floodgates. And so he has this argument with Brunner, and he's convinced that Brunner is then going to become a Nazi or become associated with the party. And Brunner never does. Brunner, to his credit, is a lot more clear-sighted than Barth gave him credit for. And Barth actually kind of apologized to him for that later on in life. But that's what he's worried about. And other people are actually making that mistake. You get this German Christian movement as Nazism gets, much more electoral success, especially when the Nazis, when Hitler becomes chancellor and then the Nazis are in charge of the levers of power, which include in Germany the administration of the churches. There's basically a secretary, a cabinet position for managing the churches. This German Christian movement develops where they are making the explicit identification between the people of God and the German folk, Volk with a V, pronounced folk. They're making that identification. They're wanting to say that in the person of the Führer, of Hitler, God is making a world historical statement, right? That somehow Hitler is a revelation of God. And they're putting swastikas on pulpits and all over churches. And, they're really doing in this very explicit way the kind of identification that Barth has been trying to intellectually avoid for, at that point, 15 years,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so he becomes one of the leaders, the intellectual leaders of the confessing church movement, which is made up of churches and pastors and ordinary church folk who don't think that what the German Christians are doing are right and want to resist the different ways that Nazism is infiltrating the administration of the churches. For some people, like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, I don't know how familiar you are, Bonhoeffer saw very early the anti-Semitism that was
Mm.
built into all that. He was one of the earlier and more clear-sighted folks on that issue. So certain parts of the confessing church are more alive to that than other parts of the confessing church. You still get these currents in the confessing church when war breaks out A lot of them rush off to enlist to show that they're really actually patriots, right?
Mm.
We're not against Germany. We're just against this, the Nazis and meddling with the church structures, right? So the confessing church is not all heroes in the same way.
Okay.
But it was one of these bodies that was trying to resist to some extent, and Barth played an important role in that. Barth eventually got kicked out of Germany by the Nazi government because he refused to begin his classes with the Nazi salute, the Heil Hitler, and also he would not take the oath of loyalty that was required of employees of the state. Which was changed under Hitler to refer directly to loyalty to Hitler as opposed
Mm.
to the German state. And so after a process, Barth was kicked out from his teaching position at that time in Germany, and he went back to Switzerland and started teaching at the University of Basel and was there for the rest of his career. But then even in Switzerland, this is much less well known, but the Swiss government really didn't like him
Okay.
because he would constantly be making negative statements about Hitler and the Nazis and all of this stuff. And Switzerland's trying to stay neutral.
Yeah.
And so
That
he's
makes
just
sense.
he's just making it uncomfortable for them. And Eberhard Busch published, who was Barth's last research assistant,
Okay.
published a big book on basically what Barth was up to during those years in Switzerland and ways that he supported efforts to get Jewish refugees out of Germany and into Switzerland, and all of that. So he remained active in some of those practical ways, even though he's just kind of going on with his dogmatic theology, trying to build this intellectual structure. So I think that catches us up a bit
Yeah.
for
No, dude, that was
Bart's
so
story.
great. That's such a great kind of overview. I guess really kind of my last like really big question that'll maybe bring some things together is, can Karl Barth speak to us today in terms of what's happening? I mean, in American Christianity with like the Christian nationalism, but just, as a society. And before you kind of give your thoughts on that, as I was kind of thinking about this episode, I came across this great quote by Peter Berger, the American sociologist, who said something like, in a world full of Nazis, you can be forgiven if you're a Bardian. And I just thought there was a lot in that quote that you would probably enjoy too. But yeah, I mean, how do you think about what's happening in like American Christianity and as a society? And then can Bart speak to it in any way? Is he a theological resource in your opinion?
I think so. And like I said, I think in many ways he represents the best of the tradition that I find myself in, which is
Sure.
um, white dude Protestantism,
Okay.
right? Um, he represents the best of that. And a version of that, that if you understand what you're reading, tells you that you need to listen to other people too, right? You need to listen to the experience of our Black brothers and sisters, our Latina and Latino brothers and sisters, and just all the way our LGBTQ plus brothers and sisters, right? We need to listen to their experiences and their grapplings and their articulations of the divine if we want to really understand what God is up to in the world. If you are reading Barth correctly, you know that you need to do that. And I think there are people out there who don't read Barth correctly. I've said before, if you're doing dialectical theology and it's not it's a question of authority and not freedom, then you're doing it wrong, right? Because dialectical theology is all about freedom and freedom to live for one another in community, in solidarity with the marginalized, in pursuit of faithfulness to what God is up to in the world. So that's what dialectical theology is all about. I think that it very much speaks to our situation in North America today. I've got an essay. It's buried in a kind of boring sounding academic book called Theology and the Political.
Oh, okay.
But the title of my piece is Evangelicalism, Authoritarianism, and Socialism,
Mm,
Dialectical Theology in 21st Century America. And I
okay.
really try to get into this issue, and then I draw on Barth and Paul Tillich and Helmut Gollwitzer to kind of provide the antidote, so to speak. And I I guess I'll just read some of the conclusion, because it's
Wonderful, please.
a
Yeah,
little
that
bit
sounds great.
prohibitive to get this, but um, this essay accomplishes two tasks. First, it provides a glimpse behind the curtain of the contemporary political scene in the United States. That glimpse, for me, involves developing a sense of how the abhorrent alliance formed between the unholy trinity of evangelicalism, capitalism, and nationalism, how it formed, and how that alliance fuels a subtle and sometimes not so subtle authoritarian drift. It also highlights contributions that dialectical theology made and might continue to make to combating that drift and the captivity of the gospel that aids and abets it. And so Barth rejects the gospel's captivity. And then, there's all the specific theological tools that he develops for that. And that's how he can contribute. And I kind of I played around with this. And as part of this conclusion, I draw on Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. I don't know if
Nice.
you're a Harry Potter fan.
Yeah.
I love the series. I think that Rowling has screwed it up since she
Mhm.
finished writing the series itself. Um, but in Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, we're introduced to a fearsome monster, the Basilisk. This ancient serpent possesses deadly and venomous fangs and a murderous stare, and has been locked away in the caverns beneath Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry for centuries. Evil wizards periodically release it to prey upon a terrorized student body, usually in the interests of protecting the ostensible purity of wizarding blood. The basilisk possesses one natural enemy. It flees only from the crowing of the rooster, which is fatal to it. The relationship between the rooster and the basilisk illustrates the relationship between contemporary American evangelical theology and dialectical theology. For dialectical theology is designed to be the rooster's cockcrow to the monstrous basilisk of American evangelicalism's abhorrent alliance with capitalism and nationalism. While the abhorrent alliance encapsulates many of the Western white Protestant theological tradition's worst impulses, dialectical theology provides an example of that tradition at its best, insofar as it takes the side of the oppressed in faithfulness to encounter with the holy other God of the gospel. So I really do think that in a context, a socio-political and theological context in North America that is defined by the worst of white dude Protestantism, being able to oppose it with the best of white dude Protestantism helps to defang it, and then creates space for other versions of Christianity and other ways of creating meaning in the world that are not white dude Protestantism, right? Which is really, I mean, we need that variety, and we need that broader insight brought. I mean, our world is an increasingly diverse place in all kinds of different ways, but the political conversation just keeps getting narrower.
That's well said.
And so, what I appreciate about dialectical theology is, in many ways, it can stand toe to toe with evangelical theology, demonstrate its failures, and thereby create space to hear other voices.
Mm. Oh, that's so good, man. Ah, I really like that. Okay, I feel like that's a great place to kinda end in terms of my questions. What was there anything else, either about Bart or yourself or your scholarship, that you wanted to kinda throw out there kinda before we come to a close? This has been great, by the way.
I mean, well, thanks. I appreciate that. Um, I don't think I have much else to say, although I will say this. When I was writing my Gollwitzer book, I thought to myself, um, does the world really need another book on theology written by one white dude about another white dude?
Mm,
And most of me, I think, answered no. But I really wanted to get Gollwitzer, as a student of Barth, and we can say this about Barth as well. I really wanted to help people find those resources um, for exactly the kind of reason that I just mentioned. But at the same time, I was like, well, really, they just need to read James Cone.
okay.
I don't know if you know James Cone.
Yeah.
He died a number of years ago now, but hugely important theologian in the Black theology tradition. Um, Incredible thinker. different from Barth in some key ways, although similar to Barth in some key ways. And I have just, in more recent years, been incredibly nourished by an encounter with him. I'm no expert by any means, but I got to him through Goldwitzer,
Wow.
because Goldwitzer um, saw what he was up to, paid attention to the civil rights issue in the United States, actually came over and participated in Martin Luther King Jr.'s funeral.
Oh,
Um,
man.
and when Cone started writing his stuff on Black theology and saying that white folks need to become Black if they're going to be saved, Goldwitzer started telling people, hey, you got to pay attention to this. Like, this is not wrong. And Goldwitzer learned a lot from Cone and tried to amplify that voice as well, using what he could. And so part of me just wants to tell people to go read James Cone. Um,
I like
but
that. Yeah,
if
let's
you
do
need some
that.
help getting there, if you need some background to help you understand what Cone is up to, Barth and Goldwitzer aren't the only places you can and should go, but they will also help.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's really good. Okay, well, Travis, again, thank you so much for your time, for being on the podcast, and yeah, I hope our paths cross again in the future.
Yeah, my pleasure. If you want to talk Goldwitzer or baptism or anything else, just hit me up. And thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, thanks, man.